Talk to Ralph Schoellhammer, who is an author and professor of economics and international relations at Vienna's Webster University. Ralph, great to have you on the programme again. How are you doing?
Peter, fantastic to be on. There's so much to talk about. I hope we get to all of it.
There certainly is. We've loads of time, which is good. I decided, as soon as I knew you were coming on, I knew we would need more time with you because you have so many interesting things to say. And I gather you're going to be in the studio next week. You're going to be here in the UK, is that right?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yes, yes. I'll try to do everything to make this a regular thing, trust me.
Wonderful. Well, I look forward to meeting you in person, Ralph, because you're one of our most popular guests. First of all, tell us about Rishi Sunak and Giorgia Meloni working together to try to get some advancement in terms of what is happening with migration, both with Lampedusa in Italy, major problems for Italy, also in the UK. Are other European nations listening?
Yes, and I think there are two things that are important to mention. One is, if you look at the press release that was issued by the Prime Minister and others after the meeting they had, it's very disappointing. I mean, it includes everything from climate change to addressing the root causes to getting local partners and the UN involved. And this is all government speak for basically saying, let's continue to try to bribe the local strongman and hope they will take up the problem for us. I mean, on the long run, this is not going to work. We see this with Turkey. We are trying this as a EU with Tunisia, and Tunisia is already walking back their commitments. So this is a lot of playing hot potato. Nobody really wants to address the issue and just push it to somebody else. So the 8 points they published are basically saying, we will decide to meet again in the future, to discuss again, and then we maybe decide something at some point else. I mean, if I may, can I suggest the 3 points kind of that a real action plan would look like, if you don't mind?
Ralph, you there?
Yes, are you there?
Oh, sorry, you just stopped talking. Okay.
Sorry.
That's fine. No, I just wasn't quite sure. Okay, yeah, I mean, they're mentioning all these sorts of aspects to do with immigration, and really it's just a wish list, isn't it? Because Italy and the UK have to take it seriously, of course, because there are illegal immigrants arriving on our border. But certainly other countries, we've seen the leader of Spain, for example, saying, actually, this isn't a priority for us. I suppose the question is, why should they care if they're getting rid of illegal migrants and they're going to other places? I mean, I've always asked this question about France. Where is the incentive for France to really deal with this problem in terms of people coming to the UK? Because they are getting rid of illegal immigrants.
Yeah, one reason is because others are no longer playing along, and even in France and in Spain, right, you saw in the elections that public pressure is increasing. But I think nobody's really trying to do or say the thing that has to be done. And like the idea is basically what you would have to do would be 3 steps, right? That you say the naval forces of Italy, Spain, Greece, France, and the UK, they monitor the North African coast, and they are supposed to prevent any unauthorized vessel from leaving shore. Then at the same time, you would create immigration and asylum processing centers in the region, not in Lampedusa, not on the Greek islands, but in the region at the coast of North Africa, and make sure that no individual that doesn't have a finally determined legal status has the right to set foot on European or British soil. And the last point, which I think we need to talk in greater detail, is that any individual organization that supports or cooperates with human traffickers in any way needs to be prosecuted by the fullest extent of the law and has to be branded a criminal organization. But real action has to be taken. All of this is, to be quite honest, is creating hot air. These are not actual decisions. This is, we will continue to talk about the problem. But if you look at the numbers, even a right-winger like Meloni, it's disappointing. Like, migration is more now than it was in 2015. And the only 2 countries, I have to admit, who seem to have some sense of sanity left are Hungary and Poland, because, for example, they have now been blocking the joint communication about the migration question after this meeting in Granada, because they say, to quote Viktor Orban, he said Poland and Hungary, they feel, his words, not mine, raped by this policy, and they will not support it.
Well, certainly we've got the Polish election coming up, and the context has changed there, certainly in relation to Ukraine as well. Give us your thoughts on the Polish election and really what it tells us here in the UK and also for the rest of Europe. And we'll get into those points about organisational support for migration in just a second.
Well, I think it tells us one very specific thing is a lot of the debate also in Great Britain very often when it comes to migration is, right, the argument, well, we have international contracts, we have international law that binds us to agreements with the European Union. But to give you one example, as you just said, Poland is voting very soon. One of the biggest segments of the population is the agricultural sector in Poland. And They are simply banning agricultural imports from Ukraine, which is in direct violation of EU law. But the Poles don't care, because for them, the argument is our national interest comes first. But you see something else. There's a new party that's called Konfederacja in Poland that is much more critical of support for Ukraine, and they're also gaining in the polls. We had just 2 weeks ago votes in Slovakia, right, where a very Ukraine critical candidate was winning the election. So what is happening in Europe at the moment? And this was something some of us saw coming already over a year ago, that there is a tiredness, like support, public support, but also political support for Ukraine is declining. And I think this will continue. We tend to forget, even though Poland has been a staunch defender and still is a supporter of Ukraine, what binds them together is more the opposition to Russia than like a deep-seated sentiment of sympathy for the Ukrainians.
Yes, that is a fascinating one, isn't it? Because a lot of people said, oh, Poland, you know, with the history of Poland, why is it sort of being so critical now of Ukraine? But it's interesting. Do you think there's a fatigue here in regard to Ukraine? Because we've seen the Americans, for example, ask for $25 billion worth of military support for President Zelensky. And now we're in a situation where they've been given $325 million, a mere fraction of what they were asking for.
No, absolutely. The fatigue is real. And the really painful thing is, and I say this with all carefulness, because I think like you and all your viewers, if I would have any say, I would love to reestablish the territorial integrity of Ukraine, right? I would love for them to win this conflict. So from a moral perspective or a wishful thinking perspective, that is no question. But the problem is, it's only in a peaceful world where we can tell ourselves that all countries, regardless whether they are large or small, are kind of at the same level, right? Kind of, we are all sovereign nations. We all deal with each other on the same level. At times of conflict, as right now, it turns out that ultimately decisions are being made by the great powers. So this idea, this approach by Western politicians that the war goals can only be defined by Kiev. Again, I get the moral content of this, but this is not how international politics
But you mentioned the moral context as well. It's interesting that Jean-Claude Juncker, who's not someone I'm a fan of, but is nonetheless a very, someone who was a very serious politician in the EU, called Ukraine corrupt this week. That was very, very interesting as well, because certainly here in the UK, I mean, there's so little actual looking into how corrupt Ukraine is as a country. We lionize Zelensky and say everything he's doing is absolutely perfect, but it is a very corrupt country.
I have to admit, even if they weren't a corrupt country, I think it wouldn't change the geopolitical facts on the ground, which is we have now a military stalemate. We know the Russians. If you know anything about Russian history, right, Russia is a garrison state. There are not many countries, maybe Prussia in the 19th century, right, where so much in a country is aimed towards the military. Now, they failed militarily, right? That was a disappointment. But if you look at the economy, everybody was mocking the Russian economy 18 months ago and says, they are very small. Remember John McCain, Russia is a gas station that pretends to be a country. But it turns out if all you have is energy and weapons, in times of global conflict, that actually matters. So we have underestimated Russia. That is not, to be clear, I'm not taking Russia's side.
No, I don't think anybody would accuse you of doing so, but it is absolutely clear that they're a crucial world player, and even more so when those energy needs are much greater in a warlike scenario.
And you see something else now happening, just as a real quick overview, because you also mentioned Israel before. If you look at this, like 2 years ago, Joe Biden retreated from Afghanistan. Like this was perceived in Beijing, in Moscow and other areas of the world as kind of a sign that the United States are no longer serious about their role as the global order maker. Now, what happens if you have a vacuum in international politics? It gets filled. So you saw China cracking down in Hong Kong, right? You saw Azerbaijan getting active in Armenia. You saw Russia invading Ukraine. Now you see Hamas acting on the behalf of Iran. I'm 100% certain, because it's no coincidence that this happened just now, right? Acting against Israel, invading and killing civilians.
Yeah, well, let me just pause you for a second, Ralph, because we're going to, there's just a couple of things I want to mention on that, because at least 22 people have been killed, hundreds injured, officials say, after terrorists from Gaza entered Israel in this unprecedented attack. We've had all sorts of reaction from all sorts of political leaders. I've been reading it this morning. The Liberal Democrat Foreign Affairs spokeswoman Leila Moran MP condemned the terrorism of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. She says, I'm horrified to wake up to such dreadful scenes of violence in Israel and Palestine this morning. She said, last year I met with Israelis living in villages on the Gaza border. I am mortified to learn that these places are facing terrorist attacks as we speak. My thoughts are with those I met and their safety and all others who are impacted by this awful violence. Liberal Democrats fully condemn condemn the terrorism of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. The violence must cease. I'm profoundly worried about the prospect of broader escalation. Well, we have a clip from the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It's in Hebrew, but I have the transcript here and I'm going to read it out after what he says. So if we can play that clip now, we'll hear from the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu.
אזרחי ישראל, אנחנו במלחמה,
לא במבצע,
לא בסבבים, במלחמה. הבוקר חמאס פתח במתקפת פתע רצחנית נגד מדינת ישראל ונגד אזרחיה. אנחנו בתוך זה בשעות הבוקר המוקדמות. כינסתי את ראשי מערכת הביטחון. הנחיתי קודם כל לטהר את היישובים והמחבלים שחדרו פנימה. הפעולה הזאת מתבצעת בשעות הללו. במקביל הוריתי לבצע גיוס מילואים נרחב ולהשיב מלחמה שערה בעוצמה ובהיקף שהאויב לא הכיר. האויב ישלם מחיר שהוא לא ידע מותו. אני קורא בינתיים לכל אזרחי ישראל להישמע בקפדנות להנחיות הצבא, להנחיות פיקוד העורף. אנחנו במלחמה ואנחנו ננצח בה.
We're at war and we will win it. Those are the words of the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. Ralph Schoellhammer is still with me. Perhaps you could give me your reaction, Ralph, to what President Netanyahu has been saying and this, Prime Minister Netanyahu, apologies, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been saying about this and the fact that there is this horrendous violence perpetrated by Palestinian militants and specifically by Hamas terrorists.
Yeah, this is a very dangerous situation because, first of all, look at the timing. This happens exactly to the day on the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, which I think tells you that this is no coincidence. So this was definitely planned a long time ago. And what is the background, apart from the people affected, which is horrible in the region? Right? You, over the last couple of months, had a kind of rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. But what people very often don't know is while the Saudi Arabian elites have warmed up to Israel, the population has not. Just to give you one example, only 7% of the Saudi population would allow the Israeli prime minister to enter the country for an international conference. So what Iran now has done, they instigated these violent attacks by Hamas, which forces Netanyahu, who is in a right-wing coalition, to attack, as he just said in the clip that you played. It's war, right? He has to react very harshly. This, of course, will then cause a reaction in Saudi Arabia because they also have to look at what their population thinks. So how everybody now is going to act, particularly Israel, of course, and others, right? This could really be a new unraveling in a small scale in the Middle East, but it involves some of the major players, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and this, of course, then would feed back into global supply chains, into energy resources. So we are at very, very fragile geopolitical times. While we are talking, Russia is at war. Israel is gearing up for war. China and the US are preparing for war. Hopefully it's not going to happen. I think we still have not realized in Europe, including the UK, what's going on in the world. And this is what I told you last time. We need to get very, very serious. We can no longer rely on global supply chains. So something has to happen. And I'm sure we're going to have many conversations about that in the future.
Absolutely. Gaza in Yorkshire says, morning Cardi P, great show as usual. I agree with everything Ralph spoke about. He's right in every way about immigration and who should be held accountable for its impact. Lefty solicitors and politicians, I think, who capitalise financially on its actions and consequences. Actually, just back to immigration, I did say, I promised I'd mention earlier on about those organisational support. Just tell us what you think about that, Ralph, because there are people who supply and support these and need to be targeted, really, when it comes to immigration.
Yeah, and I think this is what I said before. It's in the end, this is an operation that has to be conducted, quote unquote, either like a police operation. If this is what you mean, right? In the region, if you take the German government, is for example funding NGOs that are clandestinely or openly, depending on which reports you trust, with human traffickers. And I think this is something that is, again, Europe shooting itself in its own foot. Governments must make a commitment to something that their people have been calling now for over 30 years. Yeah. If you look at the rise of the right wing in Europe, it starts in the 90s around, a little bit earlier, and the main topic is migration. Like there are no right wing parties in Japan or China because they don't have that migration question.
It's
that's the reason why we have them in Europe.
It's a very, very interesting point, Ralph. I'll look forward to seeing you in the studio next week. Thank you so much for your contribution. Ralph Schoellhammer there, who is author and Professor of Economics and International Relations